The infant's mouth closed around my finger like a secret, and the world narrowed to a small, wet weight trembling in my arms, while sirens and shouted orders hammered against the metal of the makeshift hangar. I tasted copper and something impossibly sweet, an alien milk that pulsed warm and phosphorescent as if it had been born from stars. And for a breath, I forgot the cameras, the armed men in blackout vests, the clause in my contract that forbade attachment. The baby's keening was a hollow ache I recognized from a lifetime of grief. It matched the sound my own chest had made the night my child had been taken. My hands knew what to do before my head did. I cradled the creature to my breast because the only thing I had left in this world that belonged to love was the muscle of my heart and the memory of feeding. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They called me in at 2 in the morning, a quiet voicemail stitched with urgency. Dr. Marquez, classified retrieval, your expertise is needed. I told myself I had volunteered because I was a xenobiologist and because the agency had promised data and containment. I told myself I had been chosen because of my knowledge of transmembrane proteins and xenograft immunology, not because of the gap in my life that still formed a hollow like a missing rib. I drove to the coordinates with my hands tight on the steering wheel and photographs of a boy I had lost pinned behind my teeth. Jonas, 5 years, brown curls, the way he used to insist that the world smelled like oranges in summer. I had been naive once, certain science could ordain closure. That certainty had died in a sterile white room with a file stamped confidential. The agency had pawed through my past like a taxonomist, finding those places where grief had been cataloged, and had offered me, not solace, but a job that fit those wounds. The crash site smelled of scorched earth and ozone, an accidental altar to something not human. They had cordoned the desert with black tents and fluorescent lights, a small city that drilled into the dark with its own sun. Screens flared with intercepts. Technicians moved with the nervous choreography of men who half-believed miracles were exploitable resources. The craft, a perfect tear in the sky that had folded steel like paper, rested sight-pinned and smoking, its skin iridescent and strange. I was briefed in a tent that smelled of coffee and disinfectant. You will catalog biological signatures, identify non-human biomolecules, and advise on compatibility, the lead scientist said. But his eyes watched my face as if expecting me to crack. No contact without authorization, he added, the sentence a hard edge. I found the infant by accident, the way you find a secret when you stop looking only at the map. The agency's field team had been processing the perimeter when an operative came running, white-booted and almost laughing with nervous disbelief. "There's movement inside," she said. I remember arguing, protocol, containment, words that sounded both professional and futile. The hatch had been sealed. The team pried it open, and light pooled in, revealing a compartment like an incubator that shimmered with condensation. The creature inside looked like language made soft, translucent skin stretched over delicate bones, veins like map lines, eyes too large for its face that reflected us with a dawning, terrible intelligence. It clutched at the wiring like a newborn to a cord. When it reached for me, there was no plan left in the room. The keening it emitted was not mechanical. It was a primitive thing that spoke to the oldest parts of the brain, the parts that had kept infants alive since humankind had first formed small fires. Someone said no, and I think my mouth formed the opposite. I had been trained to observe, not to hurt, and the idea of a tiny life reduced to specimen made something inside me harden and then crumble. I picked the child up, the agency line sparking with alarm. Cameras pivoted, men in vests readied restraints. I took the infant to a tent that smelled of antiseptic and fear, and I did something the manuals forbidden. I put it against my skin. The species' physiology bent expectation like glass. The infant took to me with a suction that hummed through bone and marrow. For hours it fed, and something happened that no one had predicted. The milk my body did not have, not biologically prepared for this specimen, altered. It was not a miracle so much as a chemistry problem solving itself in real time. My breasts warmed. Cells signaled across membranes as if remembering a blueprint lodged in the marrow of some evolutionary common ground. The agency's equipment recorded anomalies, proteins that shouldn't exist, sugars that behaved like keys in doors. But the tapes were less urgent to me than the swell of small weight against my chest, the rise and fall of breath, the tiny palm that clung to the hair at my collarbone. We were not alone in the tent when the mother arrived. She did not walk. She existed as a slow illumination that slipped through the fabric of the night like a tide. Kara's presence rearranged the air. She was tall in a way that made my vertebrae ache. I could see bone translated by another physics. And where her skin should have been, there was instead a faint bioluminescent lattice that shifted color with thought. Her arrival made the agency agents smaller, democratically humbled even behind their training. She spoke without moving her mouth, a vibration that threaded into my inner ear. The tent filled with an understanding I couldn't translate, but which my body, in the taut soft of maternal memory, recognized. "You feed her," she said, and the syllables landed as a demand, not a request, not the starving pleading of a refugee parent. It was the command of one who expects obedience, and also the naked plea of a mother who knows the shapes of risk. Kaira's eyes, if I could call them that, were flooded with grief. Her light dimmed on the margin and flared hot with something like wrath. The infant's limbs trembled against me as if it had known her before language. Around us, the men in blackout vests made calculations with their eyes, their orders, their charts, their plan to secure assets. The lead scientist's mouth turned into a thin line. "This is unauthorized," he said, but his voice carried not command, but an attempt at salvage. "Protocol dictates separation and analysis," another man supplied, the pretense of procedure a protective shroud over greed and fear. Kaira's light sharpened, and something in the tent translated into an image that I could feel rather than see. Compartments, tests, needle marks like teeth, a wall of glass between mother and child. Instruments designed to map and extract. There was a diplomacy in her rage, the kind born of cultures who must choose tactics under the weight of annihilation. She stepped closer to me and lowered a hand. The air smelled like the inside of a battery, like ozone and cold metal. And when her fingers touched my skin, I felt 100 ancient currents rearrange. "You will feed her," she repeated, but now her voice scraped at a tenderness. "You will give what your body holds. In exchange, you will bind yourself." Bind myself. The word made my spine tingle. The agency had already drawn up forms in the margins of my recruitment file that might have read consent, but whose ink smelled like ownership. Kara was offering a different exchange, a bargain that confused my training. In her culture, there were other currencies, trusts traded through skin, promises sealed with scent, alliances stitched by the smallest acts of intimacy. In that slender exchange, Kara staked a position. If Elena Marquez would hold and feed, then Kara could, perhaps, save her child from becoming property. I remember the scientist pressing a tablet against my sternum like an anchor. "You can't," he said, each word thin and brittle. "You volunteered for a recovery mission, not for direct contact. The legal ramifications." My laugh was a small, strangled thing. Legal ramifications. As if grief made a woman immune to bureaucracy, but not to the logic that had raised weapons to secure a secret. The infant's eyes found mine, and the world was triangular then. Me, the small translucent being, and the luminous mother whose shadow it was. The choice opened like a wound. Feed and be complicit in an attachment that might make me an asset. Refuse and consign a life to the sterile wash of tests I knew by rote. I thought of Jonas and the hollow in my chest, of the night I had watched doors close. The agency's walls could enclose biological wonders. They could not enclose the sudden burning imperative that gripped me. If I feed her, I said, what are you giving me in return? Kara's light shifted into a slow pulse that I read like breath. She produced then, impossibly, a band, thin and needleless, a loop of living metal that slid over my wrist when she pressed it in. It pulsed in sympathy with the infant's heartbeat. Protection, she said. The word was small, but it hung with an authority that made the agents behind us flinch. Promise. Binding meant something else, too. Becomes a signal to her people that the child had been entrusted, not captured. A political mark that would echo in otherworldly negotiations. My signature, my body, my choice, would be a fissure in the agency's absolute. It would place me between two powers, a species whose biology could alter the architecture of life, and a government that would file everything under control. I could feel the edges of that choice slicing into me. You understand that this could mean loss of clearance, immediate detention, the scientist said, but his voice carried, suddenly, an undercurrent of pleading that betrayed guilt. He had children, perhaps? He had nightmares? Or perhaps he simply feared losing the prize he had catalogued. The baby whined, a thin sound that threaded through the fluency of argument like an accusation. The tent closed around me, and for a dizzy instant I saw the scales of possible futures. Black tents and glass jars, a child's life reduced to samples, headlines about the militarization of alien biology, or a small luminous family walking away into an uncharted world because one human woman had chosen to break a rule. I fastened the band around my wrist because choices sometimes arrive like tides, and the body answers before the mind can rationalize. The band clicked cool and alive, and the infant sighed like a sea opening. Kara's light softened. The scientist's mouth curved into what might have been anger. More likely, it was fear. Someone in the tent called up the chain of command. Outside, engines idled and men took positions as if expecting violence. I had volunteered because I thought data would heal me. Now I had chosen to trade my career for a single act of mercy. The first feed ended in silence, thick with consequences. The infant slept against my chest, its breath a luminous whisper. And Kara watched as if cataloging something essential about me. My hands, the way I held, the shape of my grief. When she bent to touch the baby's forehead, she leaned into the thing that made her human in a different register, the surrender of control to another life. That night, under the buzz of sodium lights, I learned the shape of an impossible promise. I had given a woman, an envoy from beyond the stars, something that belonged to me and something that belonged to no one but memory. Kayera had made me a ward, and in the exchange had bound me to dangers I could not yet name. The agency would not let go easily. The band on my wrist hummed against my pulse like a countdown, and the choice I had made hung between us as if a blade had been buried there. Feed the child and face a world that might take everything, or betray the infant and all that it represented. I closed my eyes and tried to map a future with one hand while the other held a sleeping, alien weight that was as fragile as hope. The band hummed against my wrist like a small animal, patient, insistent, alive. It warmed under my skin, a gentle pressure that made me acutely aware of breath and pulse and 1,000 things I had sworn to forget. Around us, the field teams shuffled into roles that had nothing to do with tenderness, securing perimeters, logging assets, arguing over jurisdiction. But inside the tent, the world had narrowed to the soft mechanics of a creature who needed feeding and the woman who had asked me to give it. They put me under debrief lights at dawn, but debrief felt like theater. Men with sharp shoulders and hollow humor sat across from me and read from the same list of risks and regulations they believed could govern the unimaginable. Their questions had the same cadence, clinical, dispassionate, until the scientist who had first warned me leaned in and his voice turned grainy with something like supplication. "Dr. Marquez, you understand the political ramifications of this. You understand that once you—" He stopped because the infant shuddered and lifted its head to the sound of his voice, recognizing timber and danger in a way that made my chest tighten. "Once you feed, your physiology changes. The band is a marker. It signals an exchange. Diplomatic channels will be forced open. Or will be arrested," another voice countered. It had the sharp finality of a ledger. "We can't have an individual," he gestured at me as if I were a misplaced comma in an equation. "Determine contact." I wanted to tell them about Jonas with the flatness of someone listing variables on a board, but grief does not fit into equations. It rearranges them. Instead, I said what I had been trained to say in labs and lecture halls. We need controlled observations. We need to understand the biochemistry in situ before any policy can be formed. It sounded like a shield and felt like a lie. In truth, the infant's breath against my collarbone had rearranged the architecture of my life already. Policies were scaffolding. Something finer, loyalty, shame, the upwelling of a protective hunger had taken root beneath where protocols could search. Keira did not attend the debriefing. She remained at the edge of the secured perimeter like an absence given shape, her light pooling around the crash like a low tide. The band on my wrist glowed faintly when her presence neared, then steadied, as if comforted. For the first 24 hours, I learned the raw, intimate edges of our bargain. When the infant woke, it sought the warmth of my skin. It was an animal of attention and pattern, of tiny rituals that placed me at the center of its world. When I did not offer myself, it fussed with a hunger that made my own ribs ache as if I had been deprived of air. Sometimes I dreamt Jonas's small hand in mine, and the dream braided itself into the current life until I could not tell which aching belonged to which child. We attempted to formalize boundaries. The lead scientist insisted on monitors and observation windows. The agency insisted on armed escorts. Keira insisted on presence without interference. Each demand changed the shape of our nights. One evening, as the desert wind made the tents flutter like tentative flags, an agent tried to take the infant for a medical scan. The creature's keenings swelled into something closer to terror. "Leave her!" The agent's gloved hands hesitated. For a moment I saw compassion and the hard training that taught men to subdue rather than soothe. He stepped back. "You're making this harder," the scientist whispered to me later, but his voice had softened. He was tired in a way that suggested he had slept badly for years. "We're not just dealing with biology. The band ties you to them. It complicates chain of command. You could be a bargaining chip." "You already sold my chip when you hired me," I replied, "because grief is a blade that sometimes is remembered in jest." It was unfair to everyone in the room except the one who had not been given the chance to bargain, the infant whose life and future had become a pivot on which governments could tilt. Keira's presence complicated something else, my authority over my own limits. She watched me feed with the clinical detachment of a scientist and the raw vulnerability of a parent. Once, after a feed that left me drained and dizzy, she touched my face. The sensation of her fingers was like light passing through water. She was not human, and yet her touch carried a comfort that unsettled every fortress of doubt inside me. It was not sexual, it was recognition. She did not say thank you in any language I knew, But when she placed her hand over the band on my wrist, I felt the pressure of an alliance tightening. "You are not like them," she said at one point, and I understood the pronoun to be both a consolation and a reproach aimed at the human assembly who saw everything as assets. "You are not their instrument." The band buzzed. The infant curled against my chest and slept as if soothed by the unspoken translation. Tensions outside the tent swelled. News had not yet leaked beyond layers of classification, but information travels like water through cracks. Rumor poured into the dry bones of the desert informs the government could not wholly seal. Operatives from a parallel agency began to probe the perimeter under the pretense of mutual interest. Their uniforms were whisper close to ours, and their questions tried to unsettle. "Who authorized this liaison?" one of them asked a soldier in our camp, and his hand went to his rifle the way a fearful animal's foot might find its own tail. The scientist collected data with a kind of manic devotion that masked how hollow he had become. He took swabs of the infant's skin, recordings of its keening, chromatograms of the alien milk that my body produced when the child nursed. He kept his notebooks like reliquaries. "If we can learn how this transfer occurs," he said, "we can prevent disease, we can advance medicine." The sentence was greedy and bright and immediately made me think of the long list of contractors who had once made offers for my research. I thought then of Jonas's file labeled Incident and the quiet auctions of grief I had witnessed in sterile rooms. Hope and exploitation sit close together. The agency had been quick to teach me that. Kayera watched his fervor with the calm of someone who had seen empires bloom and wither. "You would take a child and name your advantage," she said one dusk in the low language that vibrated at my sternum when she spoke. She did not raise her voice. Her words were a current that made the tense poles creak. "We do not bargain with flesh." There was sorrow in the statement, as if her species had been taught the hard calculus of loss. Weeks, if our time was measured in the tense units of comprehension, passed in cycles of feeding, records, and threats. My career line blurred into privation and duty and an identity that no manual could categorize. I was scientist, caretaker, bargaining agent, and target. The band on my wrist became a map of the shifting redundancies in my life. It glowed faintly when Kayera neared, flared when operatives from outside our camp came within a certain radius, and hummed like a living thing at night when the desert wind tried to steal our heat. The infant changed too. Its translucence became less alien with each day as it fed and grew, veins and muscles knitting in patterns that began to look almost familiar. It learned my face, the cadence of my breath, the way I often hummed without realizing it. Once I caught it studying my hands as if memorizing their geometry. There were times when it stared at me and I felt unglued, because those small eyes held not only the raw intelligence of an odd species, but also a mirror to my own loneliness. It was learning love in the most precarious laboratory possible. This closeness produced fractures in those around me. The scientist's wife, who had visited under a white heat of curiosity and a private appetite for power, watched with a pitying, perilous clarity. "Elena," she said once while we stood by the field's edge and watched the sunset wash the tents in slow gold, "are you sure this is about science and not about—" She let the question hang. "There are accusations that are softer than knives and just as precise. What you lost." I did not deny it. How could I? The band around my wrist pulsed like a heart that belonged both to me and to another. There is a cruelty inherent in recognition. To deny what you are is to betray every honest thing you've ever felt. If I had not lost Jonas, I said, I might still make decisions that are easily categorized on paper. But I did. This is how I'm learning to be human again, by caring for a life that needs me. Her silence was an agreement and a judgment. People close to power make moral calculations all the time. Some calculate toward mercy, others toward preservation. In the camp, preservation took the form of increasing security measures. Clips and cages, sterile transport, language designed to make the next step easier. Extraction. I watched men plan for a future where the infant would be studied under glass, where Kayera would be forced to negotiate across a table instead of across the quiet of a tent. One night, a breach happened. A line of men in dark uniforms crept toward our section of the perimeter under the cloak of a simulated dust storm. Their intent was clear: to recover artifacts and test subject alike before the diplomatic wheels could be set into motion. The alarms flared. I felt the band on my wrist flare like bellows, and for the first time, the instrument's glow felt less like a necklace and more like a beacon. We moved then with a speed learned from danger. Kayera's light cut the darkness into ribbons, confusing sensors and disorienting the intruders. She did not fight with weapons. She unmade the angles of their approach, rendering their electronic tools useless as if rewiring the night. Men stumbled like fishermen in bright surf. The scientist shouted orders that meant nothing under the new weather. The intruders hesitated, then regrouped. In the pause, a choice presented itself, like a blade at my throat. Run with the infant and Kayera into a night that would mark us as fugitives, or stand and defend the fragile legality we could still claim. I moved without thinking. The infant was in my arms and its heartbeat thrummed against the band, and it seemed to me that there was only one honest answer left. I would not let them take this life for paperwork and posterity. Kayera did not protest when I lifted the child and began to run. Her luminescence wrapped around us like a cloak. The men with guns recalibrated their aim, and an agency that had leaned on the comfort of strategy found itself in the raw territory of human choice and alien will. We made it out, but not without cost. There were injuries. There was shouting that would later be captured on tapes and evaluated in rooms with better lighting and poorer conscience. There were questions that machines could ask and nothing more, questions that have no purchase on grief or the terror of a child who has been nearly taken. I returned to the tent that night with my heart pounding and the band a steady, warm presence on my skin. Kyra's light had dimmed to a slow, contented glow. The infant slept, deep and untroubled by the knowledge of danger. For a moment, I allowed myself the quiet grace of relief. The next morning, the lead scientist approached me with an unreadable expression. He had always been a man who preferred theory to chaos. Now he looked like someone who had been forced to choose between both and found neither sufficient. "You realize," he said, "that you have changed the variables of this mission in ways we are still accounting for. The agency will want to question the wisdom of allowing emotional stakes to govern protocol." "You mean my heart?" I said. "Yes, I realize it." "Then remember," he said quietly, "that the heart is a liability in fields like this." He was right in the narrowest possible way. Yet the infant's small hand found the web between my thumb and finger with the same ease with which it had latched onto my chest weeks before. In its tiny grip, there was a tiny, brutal defiance, an insistence that love, irrational, dangerous, unquantified, could be a form of resistance. I thought of Jonas again, the edges of his memory raw and bright. I thought of the band on my wrist and the way Kyra's fingers had fit over it like a map. I thought of the scientist's words, and I knew the truth pressing into my ribs. Either I would let the agency and the world reduce this luminous life to data, or I would teach myself new kinds of courage. The field hummed with preparations for negotiation. Men sharpened their arguments, and Kyra retreated into the quiet of her presence. The infant fed and slept and learned to know me, and with each passing day, the web of obligations grew thicker around my throat. I had accepted a bargain that made me a bridge and a target in equal measure, and the lights of approaching agencies, human and otherwise, promised that the next act of our lives would force me to decide which currencies I would spend, the currency of compliance or the currency of something far older and fiercer, maternal defiance. They found the footage 2 nights later, raw, grainy clips from a drone that had hovered too close to the tents and recorded everything the men thought they had contained. On the screen, I watched myself in slow, awkward clarity. The way my shoulders stooped when the infant fussed, the way I pressed my face into the child's hair as if it could stitch the missing pieces of Jonas back together. The video did not care for nuance. It edited tenderness into scandal and then sent the file out into an orbit of committees that had been waiting for validation that their fears were right. When the lead investigator, someone with a jaw carved by endless hearings, presented the clips in a closed session, the room felt like a graveyard of intention. Men and women in uniform passed eyes around like currency. The scientist beside me, who had been at once my ally and my tacit accuser, took a step back, as if distance might halt the tidal force of what was happening. "We could have controlled this," he said, and the sentence was a confession for both of us. Kayera did not speak in that meeting. She did not need to. Her presence was a pressure against the room, the kind that unmade postures. When the agency lobbyist asked if the band on my wrist was a tracking device, she let the silence answer. When the council suggested that the infant be moved to a more secure facility for proper study, Kayera's light concentrated into a sharp line that made the attorneys stumble. It was subtle, and yet the room shifted, enough for someone to notice, for someone to fear. "You cannot legally," the council began, "but law is brittle when new forms of life are involved." No one was sure which statutes applied. The treaties for contact were tentative, written in hopeful ink, and never meant to be used on a trembling human breast. The lobbyist slid a thick folder across the table. "We can draft emergency custody," he said. "We can declare the infant an asset of the state." Hearing the infant named an asset made something within me break with a clean, sharp sound. I felt the band on my wrist grow heavier with the knowledge that it marked me not only to Kara's people, but to legislation and ledger. "You want to turn a child into property?" I said, my voice raw. "A being that has a mother's scent and a child's small fist." "Child is a categorization," the investigator parried. "This is an unknown organism with potential biosignatures that could be weaponized. We have a duty of care to protect human life first." That sentence, "human life first," fell into the pit of me like a grenade. Kara's life flared then, an indignation that felt less like anger and more like bone-deep sorrow. She stepped forward and for the first time addressed the room directly. Her voice was not the soft undercurrent of the tent, but a tide that filled every cavity of the chamber. "You will not take my child and call it property," she said. The words vibrated in a manner I felt through my teeth. "You will not turn flesh into asset and call it safety. There are other ways to measure risk." The investigator's patience thinned. "You do not understand human frameworks," he said. "We must consider quarantine, immunological threat." "I understand enough," Kara replied. Her light pulsed. Images translated into my mind with the bluntness of weather. She showed us, not with words, but with sense, fragments of futures, laboratories filled with glass cages, children like the one in my arms arrayed on tables, contracts signed with hands that did not understand tenderness. The images burned through the room like acid. The meeting dissolved into accusations and proclamations. Someone mentioned sanctioning my clearance. Another hinted at criminal charges for unauthorized contact. The scientist who had once scolded me now kept his eyes lowered, as if guilt had given him vertigo. I learned then how quickly allies convert to auditors. Intimacy made me suspicious to those who profit from detachment. After the session, I walked back to the tent like a condemned person who had been spared on a technicality. The desert night opened with the same indifferent sky, stars like a jury. The infant slept against my chest, its breath a thin tide. Kyra hovered at the edge of our circle of light, her luminescence dim and private. For the first time, I saw real fear in her, less for herself than for the continuity of what she represented, for the fragility of trust placed in a species that could name a child as property. "You do not belong to their pages," she said softly, and the band on my wrist hummed in answer. "They will catalog and then forget you. They will study corners until you are no longer whole." I thought of the scientist's wife, and the way pity had sharpened into accusation. I thought of my own files stamped confidential, and the way grief had been read as data for years. "And you think trusting me is better?" I asked. The question was as brutal as a scalpel, and no less necessary. I am not a blank ledger. Kyra's reaction was a slow, painful unmake. She folded her light inward and then extended a memory, no, a reality, of from elsewhere pain. She spoke of missions where her species had offered children to foreign courts to bargain for peace, only to have those children returned to hollow cages. She spoke with images that did not need translation. The soft of a child's cheek pressed against cold glass, a mother's song interrupted by alarms. "Trust is the only weapon I have," she said. "It is a thin one." It was in that exhaustion of reasoning, under the weary algebra of politics, that the first fracture in our fragile alliance widened into a jagged canyon. The scientist, who had once been my partner in wonder, came to me that night with a face that had been drained of bravado. "Elena," he said, and the name was an offering. "There are contracts being moved in other rooms. I have been told, privately, that certain parties will not rest until the infant is removed from the field. There are offers for research grants that would make this a career." "Offers?" I echoed, because the word felt obscene in the mouth of the man who had taught me to love the clean precision of data. He hesitated. "Money and security are not inherently bad, but there are people. People who will reduce a child to a data set?" I finished for him. "I know those people." He flinched as if hearing a private confession out loud. "You think we all do this for the prestige, the grants?" he said. Some of us believe in the greater good." "Then why do your hands shake when you look at that child?" I demanded. "Why do you talk about custody like it's a policy and not a theft?" His silence answered me harder than speech could. We had been split, not by ideology, but by the small, tearing edges of what each of us wanted to preserve. To him, the infant's future was a field of eventualities that could benefit millions. To me, it was a small, beating life that had just learned my face and my heartbeat. The equation had no solution that satisfied both truths. The agency's moves grew sharper. A licensed notice arrived, an order to relocate the infant to a secure facility for immediate risk mitigation. It was bureaucratic language rolled into an execution. The arrival of armored transport the next morning felt less like a procedure and more like an ambush. Men in blackout vests appeared with clipboards and sealed orders. Their presence cut the camp into a before and after. I refused the order. Kyra's light climbed high with us. The infant's keening tightened into a sound of urgent insistence. "This is unlawful," I said. And perhaps it was. Perhaps law had no compass for the moral precipice we faced. The investigator, who had once tipped his hat at procedure, now wielded it like a cudgel. "You are jeopardizing national security," he reminded me. "We have a duty to all citizens." I understood the sentence in the bone-deep place where mothers make impossible lists. There are always people who will name any life as a threat when it refuses to fit their interests. When the men reached for the infant, the tent became a theater of violence mitigated only by the simplest human defiance. I braced against their hands, the band on my wrist thrumming with a frequency I had not known it held. Kyra did not strike. Her species' methods were subtler and, in that moment, more devastating. She released a tide of memory into the room. Images of children stolen and caged, of songs interrupted by the cold hum of machines. The men froze as if struck. The infant's keening rose, then fell, as if consolation could be encoded into its small body. One operative lunged. Another lowered his weapon as if a hand had pressed against the circuitry of his resolve. The scientist stepped forward, and I thought I would break at the sight of him. He had the look of someone who had been forced to choose between principle and consequence, and had chosen both and neither. He knelt, his fingers hovering above the infant as if he were both penitent and thief. "We can do this with oversight," he said in a voice that cracked. "We can promise." Promises in that place were currency and cruelty. I had signed forms that promised non-disclosure and compliance. Those signatures had been attempts to keep the world whole by paying the price of silence. Now the reality of the infant's breath against my skin made such promises sound like bargains offered by people who had never felt the weight of a small head on their chest. It was Kyra who made the final fracture happen in the only way she could, not by violence but by selection. She extended her hand, not in demand but in relinquishment, and placed the infant's small, cool palm into mine as if to say simply, "Choose." The choice was no longer about policy. It was no longer about whether my career could survive or whether the agency could save face. It was between their machinery and my hands. It was between the logic that would feed this child to the hope of humanity's advantage and the love that made me keep my body as armor. I felt the scientist's breath leave him. The operatives hesitated. The paperwork fluttered like dry leaves. And Kyra's light pulsed with something that might have been sorrow or might have been relief. Outside the camp, other agencies shifted like predators, scenting a change in the wind. When they left, some carried by desperation, others by discipline, the rift they left behind was visible in the smallest of places. The scientist no longer visited the tent. His notebooks were tucked away like letters unsent. The investigator's smile thinned into routines of power, and he spoke of legal actions as if calling for a storm. Kyra was quieter now, and in her quiet I sensed a mistrust that could not be bridged by language. The fracture cut into me like cold. Allies became auditors, and the field I had believed would redeem my past offered only new forms of loss. The infant slept on, luminous and unknowing that it had altered the architecture of power around it. I sat with it and felt the band hum through my veins like a low, relentless drumbeat. The tent's canvas flapped in the desert wind, and I realized, without ceremony, that the world was now made of before and after the moment I had chosen to feed. When dawn came, it brought with it a thin, inevitable diplomacy. Men with cleaner uniforms, the formal rustle of summons, and the first official notice that Kyra's people had opened a channel. Her emissaries would arrive for negotiation, they said. The agency would insist on oversight. Kyra would insist on autonomy. I thought of Jonas and the hollow that had lived in me since his file had gone cold. I thought of the infant's small, translucent fist wrapped around my finger and the way it taught me what it meant to be fiercely, divisively human. Fractures had opened where trust had been naive. Secrets had revealed themselves in the sliver between science and politics. In the yawning silence that followed, I understood the dangerous beauty of what we had created, not by design, but by the accident of compassion. The tent smelled of stale coffee and milk and the iron scent of fear. Kaira's light shivered, and the band on my wrist pulsed so hard that it felt as if my heart had a partner I was only just meeting. We were no longer merely participants in an experiment. We had become the experiment. And like all experiments in which the heart is involved, it might end in brilliance or in ruin. The choice that had bound me to a mother from the stars had not absolved me of solitude. It had only shifted the terms. The fractures widened, the secrets multiplied, and the world, human and otherwise, began to rearrange itself around the small, honest gravity of a child who had made love into resistance. The armored convoy thudded away like a bad dream, and for a moment the camp exhaled as if relieved of some suffocating weight. Then the radios clicked, and human voices began to stitch plans anew. Diplomacy, it turned out, arrived dressed in paperwork and polite threats. Kara's emissaries would come. The agency would insist on oversight. The world would try to translate tenderness into treaties. I held the infant against my chest and listened to the band hum as if it were a chorus measuring each breath. The choice I had made had not spared me consequence. It had only made consequence intimate. They arrived under the pretext of negotiation. 3 figures who shimmered at the edges like fish in deep water, moving with a deliberation that made the soldiers uncomfortable. Their light was different from Kara's, cooler, older, threaded with the slow certainty of those who had practiced patience as a religion. I watched them approach the tent where we had made our fragile household of sheets and monitors, and Kara stepped forward to meet them with the gravity of a parent returning to a council with an explanation for a wound. "We offer custody," their elder said, a phrase translated into our language by tones that knifed at my solar plexus. It was not a demand, but a reading. They had seen the files, the footage that made me look less like a scientist and more like an accomplice. "Your species will study. We will watch. The child will be treated with respect." Respect was a word I had learned to distrust. Respect can be a velvet glove over a closed fist. Still, Kara's posture softened. Something in her registers decided that negotiation was better than war. She turned to me, and for the first time in days, her luminescence trembled with something like hope. "Can you walk this path with us?" she asked, and the question was a handing over of courage. "I can try," I said, because the try was the only honest thing left. My voice was small against the tent ribs, but steady enough for her to hear. The infant stirred and reached for my eyebrow with a tiny, translucent hand, drawing me back into the simplest gravity of the moment, a creature who trusted me because I had offered what could not be legislated. The emissaries proposed a facility, neutral, jointly governed, with a protocol that read like compromise and felt like a set of shackles. The agency wanted oversight mechanisms, binding clauses, limited access for scientific work. Kaira's delegation demanded cultural protections, a human steward appointed by them, and absolute veto power over experimental procedures. The negotiators spoke for hours while I fed the child and watched my hands become instruments of peace. At dusk, after a day of bartered clauses and ink, Kaira did something neither of us had expected. She offered herself as guarantor. Not as a threat, not as a bargaining chip, but as a parent who would stand by the child in person. Her emissaries argued legal frameworks, diplomatic repercussions, but Kaira's light pulsed with an ancient insistence. "I will hold my child in counsel when you will not," she said. "I will be present when decisions are made." It was a terrifying and beautiful sacrifice. To present oneself was to risk capture, to be visible to the cameras and the covetousness of committees. But to be present was also to teach a species to account for tenderness. Kaira's offer altered the tone of the negotiations. It forced the agency to confront a reality their protocols had not anticipated, that any solution involving this child would necessarily entangle flesh and feeling. "Then we need a steward," the senior negotiator said, eyes flicking to me as if seeing me for the first time as more than a variable. "Someone who understands both human procedure and," he searched for a word, "affection." Kayera looked at me, and for a breath the entire camp was reduced to the simple mathematics of two beings, one pleading with light, the other with scars. "She is already steward," Kayera said. "She has given, and therefore she is bound." The agency bristled. Boundness, in their language, often read as liability. They proposed oversight mechanisms, periodic reviews, a rotation of vetted personnel. I listened and felt the band on my wrist throb against my pulse as if it, too, registered the ways and measures of diplomacy. Then I did something I had not planned to do. I spoke for myself. "No," I said. The word surprised me with its clarity. "You cannot rotate a mother the way you rotate a technician. The infant needs stability. To you, it may be a study. To me, it is a life." The negotiator's jaw worked. This was not the answer he had expected. The room leaned forward as if to capture the sound. Kayera's light brightened as if in approval. I felt something like shame and something like resolve knot together beneath my ribs. To be a steward would mean risking legality, career, safety. It would also mean protecting the infant from being parceled out to curiosity. "What do you propose?" the negotiator asked, and there was both challenge and a hint of grudging respect. "A co-stewardship," I said. "I will remain with the infant. Kayera will be present as guardian and cultural advocate. The facility will be jointly run with non-invasive study only, and written guarantees against any procedures without mutual consent." They argued. They drafted clauses that felt like bandages over a deeper welt. They coaxed out definitions for words like consent and cultural harm and parental right. The night lengthened into legalese, and the camp hummed with a tired, raw hope. At one point, the scientist who had once admonished me stepped forward and signed a confidentiality amendment that would allow limited public oversight. And, in the small punctuation of his signature, I read apology. The morning the agreement took shape, the convoy that had threatened us returned, this time as an escort rather than a claim. An armored vehicle rolled up like an offering, and government lawyers disembarked with folders fat with clauses. Kayera met them with the serene fury of a mother who had learned the anatomy of loss and chosen perimeter over surrender. The infant clung to my shirt, and I felt the urgency of every life in the room condensed into two tiny lungs. We walked into the negotiated facility together, a sterile building that tried to look like a home. For the cameras that had been planted in the dusk of our lives, the scene read like triumph, an international agreement, a model of cooperation. For me, the truth was jagged and intimate. The facility smelled like antiseptic and fresh paint. Kayera's light made the shadows strange. The band on my wrist hummed steady as a metronome. They assigned me a role, field steward with limitations, subject to review. It was a title that read like compromise. Kayera's emissary signed a cultural pact that guaranteed her presence during any discussion about the child's care. The clauses were legal scaffolding, not sanctity, but they were something. I would keep my hands on the infant. She would keep hers on the band. At midday, a breach occurred. An activist group, parents complicit in a moral fury about governmental secrecy, tried to storm the facility's gates, driven by rumors and righteous outrage. They were stopped by security, voices raised into the thin winter air and echoing like a chorus of accusation. The infant woke in alarm, and I felt the old muscles of protectiveness tighten like wire. In the moment that followed, I chose, as cleanly as I ever had, to risk public scandal for the child's immediate safety. I stepped outside the safe room and into the lobby where the protesters gathered, my face exposed and my hands open and empty except for the infant sling. Cameras pivoted. News feeds fluttered with the image of a human woman, my face a map of grief and determination, holding an alien child like a secret given back to the world. The crowd saw a mother. The negotiators saw a complication. Strangers saw a betrayal or a courage, depending on their creed. A man in a suit approached, clipboard in hand, and demanded to see the signed documents that allowed a human to be a steward. For the first time since Jonas, I felt the ache of being asked to prove my love. I unfastened the band and showed it to him, the living metal glowing faintly against my wrist. The man's eyes widened. The band hummed as if answering a recognition only it could perceive. He had a choice then, to read the band as instrument or artifact, to judge me as rogue or mother. He hesitated, and in that pause, I felt the delicate politics of our lives tilt. Kara stepped forward then, luminous and present, and placed her hand over mine. The gesture was not theatrical. It was the reassertion of a mother's right to choose who would hold her child. The emissaries had negotiated the right to be present. Kara chose to be more. "We will not be separated," she said simply. The words were not meant for the crowd or the cameras, but for the ledger keepers of the world. They landed anyway. When the negotiators returned, paperwork in hand and eyes softer than the morning had found them, they had the grace to sign. It was not victory, but it was shelter. For the first time since we found the infant in the wreckage, I allowed myself to imagine a horizon that included laughter instead of alarms. Kara rested her head against my shoulder for a fragile, human second, an intimacy that made the band on my wrist hot under my skin. A storm followed, the slow one that lives in committees and committees. There would be hearings, and there would be people who would never forgive us. But in the facility's small room, the infant slept against my chest, breath rising and falling like a tide. And Kara stepped sentinel at the door. We had not vanquished power. We had rearranged it around something that was not data. I had risked my career, my clearance, a future built on paper, to be a shelter in a world that prefers maps to bodies. That night, Kara taught me a song in a timbre that vibrated through my bones. It was not human melody, but it had chord progressions that matched the rhythm of lullabies I had once hummed to Jonas. I sang with her as best I could. The infant cooed, and the band glowed like a heartbeat. In the small, defiant chorus of our trio, mother from the stars, woman who had lost so much, and the child who taught us both to claim, the world outside rearranged, slowly, reluctantly, amazed by the stubbornness of tenderness. There would be sacrifices to come. I knew the agency would eventually demand accountability. I suspected some colleagues would make me a cautionary tale. But in the immediacy of the infant's warmth and Kara's steady presence, I learned a different arithmetic. That to protect a life sometimes means to give up everything else. That night I lay awake with the band cool against my skin and decided finally what I had been too afraid to admit. My heart would not be a liability. It would be the only thing I had left worth risking. The negotiations settled into fragile routines, and our days folded into feeding, tending, and guarded tenderness. Kara sat at my side during reviews, luminous and small in public, fierce in private always. I signed forms that protected the child's autonomy, even as I signed away naive certainties again. The facility became a threshold where tenderness negotiated with law as we learned translation and patience. Reporters circled, activists raged, committees parsed our lives into memos and moral theater until public sympathy. The infant grew, small miracles knitting muscle and curiosity across its translucent skin every day, everywhere. It learned my heartbeat, my cadence, the way I held sorrow soft enough to cradle always. Kara taught me to sing differently, to bend grief into ritual so it might hold steady. We found small politics of joy, meal schedules, lullaby exchanges, visits that hardened into trust over weeks. The band on my wrist stopped registering alarms and began to thrumming like belonging and home. Once, when a bureaucrat threatened removal again, Kyara's eyes dimmed and then flared into resolve fierce. She walked into a hearing and spoke without translation. Silence followed, radical and simple and true. The agency relented in incremental steps, trade-offs scribbled in margins, protection slowly codified until law softened. I lost colleagues and privileges, but gained a child's trust and a strange family by choice. Nights still carried the ache for Jonas, and sometimes I woke to phantom hands and longing. Yet when the infant smiled, an impossible curve of light, I felt a new axis shift toward home. Kyara and I learned diplomacy by doing, sharing tea that tasted of salt and starlight together. Children from both worlds visited through sanctioned programs, bringing laughter that dispelled policy's cold angles gently. The scientist returned sometimes, tentative hands hovering, offering data framed as apology and restraint and reunion. The files I had feared to open were declassified in part, honoring some truths and burying. Our life contracted into small rituals that bureaucracy could monitor but not entirely understand or thwart. Once, under rain, Kyara braided my hair with light, and I laughed, surprised by peace. The infant grew large enough to stumble and call out syllables that felt like promises daily. Sometimes I still dreamt Jonas reaching, but mornings brought the small warm weight and comfort returned. That evening, Kyara rested her head on my shoulder, and we breathed family into the night.